piece. I'm not sure which channel I'm going to put this on because it could go on Bliss Brain because it's very new. Yeah, Bliss Brain. Ultimately, this is a new yoga class. Right now, my working title is The New Yoga Theory, based on 21st Century Physics Dialogues. And it just came to me a way that I could explain it, and I was trying to be brief, but it turns out this is like almost a little mini class in itself. And so this video that I'm making are sort of like, it's just like my first run to try to explain some of my concepts for what this new yoga is, and it's new Reiki, and it's not really new. Nothing is new. It's always existed, and everybody's always known about it, you know, like the mystics for millennia. But I'm just expressing it in 21st century physics dialogues. And my background is a PhD in chemical engineering, but I had my share of physics, and I can understand the lay books. So I'm going to be talking in a different type of language than regular physicists use. Mine's more visceral and experiential, kind of like how Albert Einstein imagined things. He was very visceral. And for example, talking about this theory, I start out by telling you this elevator experiment or thought experiment that Albert Einstein did. He once imagined himself accelerating through space in a rocket, and he was being pushed backwards onto the floor at the base of the rocket, and in his imagination, as he sped through space faster and faster, the acceleration gave his body a g-force and pushed him back, and at one point he felt like he was just sitting on the earth. You know, like that force on him matched the weight of gravity that you might feel if you're laying on the floor in your home, as opposed to laying on the floor in the rocket. And so he noticed in this thought experiment that he felt heavy, and he imagined adjusting the acceleration of his rocket to a constant value. We'll call that constant value of acceleration g, and that would match his weight on Earth. So if he's traveling at g acceleration on his rocket, he would feel just as heavy as if he was standing on Earth. And that is, in fact, the gravitational acceleration, which we do call g for when we do our physics problems in college. So your acceleration through space is no different than space accelerating through you. That's our epiphany here. And that was Albert Einstein's epiphany that led to his later theory, general theory of relativity. And when I say accelerating through space is no different than space accelerating through you, what I mean by there's no difference, there's probably lots of differences because the words are different, but what I mean is in terms of how we feel and our experience of it with our bodies and our senses, there's no difference. So it feels the same to me whether I'm on a rocket or on the Earth. I still feel that same heaviness. And so if I'm going to have equipment that depends on that acceleration, you know, like weights and stuff, or springs, and the readings on the equipment depend on what acceleration I'm experiencing, then at least my equipment will act equivalently in space on that rocket going at g or on Earth. So in the context of what I feel and what my equipment feels, at least my crude equipment, maybe there's modern equipment that will feel differences, but the crude equipment at Einstein's time, they're equivalent. And so because of that, he designed his theory of gravitation, general theory of relativity, with this accelerating ether concept, you know, space accelerating through you. So his general theory of relativity is like this space is moving into the Earth, causing objects to be pushed down onto the surface of the Earth and experience gravity. So anything that has mass, like the Earth, sort of like sucks in space, and it always accelerates inwardly, accelerates. So the velocity is not the important number, it's the acceleration value, how much you're accelerating through space or how much space is accelerating through you. So I start this new yoga theory with this in mind. Now that we know that space accelerates into the Earth, we're standing there, it's going through us and holding us onto the Earth. But I'm massive. I have mass on my body just like the Earth has mass. So maybe my body also pulls in ether. In fact, if I was out in space right now and floating like in a spacesuit, and there was a little particle going by, it would accelerate towards me because of my mass causing the ether to accelerate into my body. And in that, as it's accelerating into my body, if there's a dust particle in the way, it will be in that acceleration field and it'll flow into my body. And that's what gravity is. It's the ether flowing into you. That is the space. And now I want to make a distinction between space and ether. Einstein used the word space, and he meant the great empty void. And that's also what I call space. It's the great empty void. But space is very unstable. That means unmoving space. It wants to move because it has zero viscosity and infinite potential for movement because it's still, right? So it always wants to move. And the book, I believe, is called, what's that book called? Something from Nothing. Smolin, I think, wrote that. The void is unstable was his main premise, I believe. At least as far as I got into the book. I didn't read every word. Sometimes I'm just not captivated to finish reading it, and I get just what I need just by scanning it or reading the first few chapters. Anyway, the void is unstable, which is exactly what I would agree with. And I'm just saying that the void, when it starts to accelerate and move, my fingers represent little spots in that void. And it just kind of curls around, like just like smoke, very low viscosity, right? And if you blow into smoke, rising smoke, it'll kind of twirl around and go. Well, that's what we see superfluids doing, but much faster. You know, like wow, much faster than smoke. And then the next step is the void. You know, it just moves so fast that it's infinite. But in the process of moving and making all these patterns, there's some stable patterns that can form in the ether in this turbulence. And one of them is something you're all familiar with, a tornado that forms in our air, and it's sort of stable, right? It's there for a while, right? You can watch the tornado moving. It's a stable entity. Well, that is similar to what a photon is. And it turns out that in the ether, it sort of self-propels itself because it has a little puff of a vacuum behind it and then concentrated energy in front, kind of going in a twist. And as a result, the little packet just moves like a soliton. So this little wave packet sort of, let me think for a minute, does that has a certain property that it inhales space. In other words, space has to accelerate into it. It's like it has a mass. Light has a mass. It has an energy or a mass in that the space does accelerate into it, so it has a little gravity to it. And so as that little light wave goes by you, it's going to like suck in the space around you, and so you should be able to detect it. These are the hypotheses that arise out of my theory. And it also can, if it's in a crowded situation and it bounces around, it can touch its own, the head of the photon can touch its own tail and like be sucked into itself and go into a little circle like, and then that's mass. That's what mass is. It's light that's trapped in its own little circle. Or it might be dancing with another light wave, trapped with it, making particles. You know, like you might have two light waves that perfectly fit together, you know, like head, head, tail. Instead of just head and tail, you might have two together, or you might have it go twice around. The body can go twice around. So they're all multiples of lambda over 2. That's the wavelength of the light. Anyway, so all these forms of twirling ether, semi-stable packets of, soliton waves, which are the light waves form into matter, and that's what makes our bodies. And so if you kind of think of the ether flowing in, and as it flows, you know, it's kind of going, because there's so many interruptions with all the little tiny universes in there of movement, and then comes to our body, it goes in, and as it goes in and goes out the other end into the earth, it stays a while. And in fact, some of it stays in our body permanently, because it goes with part of the matter, and matter always breathes in ether, always, and it keeps going in a circle. And you'll see that all the flowing ether around us is turbulent. That's the 0-point energy field. That is, you get at the coldest possible temperature theoretically, but it still has an energy level because that void is flowing around so wildly. That's the 0-point energy field. So the ether is flowing in me, and I am now going to teach our first lesson on the new yoga theory based on 21st century physics language. So I'm sitting quietly, comfortably, and I'm observing. First of all, I'm acknowledging, based on Einstein's observations and our own discussions that we just had, I'm acknowledging that ether is accelerating through my body and holding me onto the earth. And just as an aside, these are more advanced classes, but you can be really thankful for that, and it puts you in a good mood if you can be thankful for things like that. And, really appreciate that you get to exist here as an entity in the ether that's semi-stable, which gives you emotions and happiness and stuff, potential for emotions and happiness. So I'm feeling the ether come in me, it's going through me and into the earth, and I can just sit and breathe with that in mind for a while. I'm going to do one breath thinking about that. As I exhale, I'm thanking the cosmic mind for this refreshing flow of ether that flows through me and into the earth. I'm also very thankful for the earth itself that exists so that I may be sucked onto its surface and walk around. And then the next part is when I acknowledge that the ether also, on its way through my body into the earth, on its way it stops and enters the mass of my own body, feeds it the ether it needs to continue existing and maintain its stable state, and then leaving to go into the earth, as well as staying within my body. What we would like to do is invite only the ether that is true, useful, and kind, that is good for us, into our body. And do not acknowledge or accept in anything that is harmful. This is not the purpose of my class, to address this. But it is something that advanced Reiki practitioners and other people need to contemplate so as to be a good steward of this ether and try to maximize the happiness of the universe with what we do with the ether. Now, in our meditation, we've first felt the ether go into our body and out our body into the earth. And second, we've felt the ether go into our body, stay into our body. Some goes out to the earth, but some stays inside and feeds us, keeps us alive. And now the third phase is to realize that the flowing ether that comes into our body and stays is our consciousness. The act of flowing, the act of accelerating, the act of inwardly moving, that is coming into a spiral and staying there and keeping going around in the spiral, that's inside our body. That is consciousness. In fact, ether flowing at all is consciousness. Ether flowing at all, any change at all in the void, is consciousness. But our consciousness, our personality, our ego and our body and our perception of ourselves, and this thing that we sort of have a dotted line around and call it me, that has a consciousness that is dependent upon the matter and the ether flowing into that matter. So if you want to have a better consciousness, a happier consciousness, wouldn't it make sense that your ether flowing into you would also be coherent and happy? And so it just so happens that yoga, deep breathing, gets the ether flowing in a more balanced, an ordered pattern that results in you feeling more happy and relaxed. The ether is a superfluid that curves in on itself constantly, and it is the effect of the various flow curvatures and the resulting acceleration of vector fields to give ether its 0-point field energetic value. So a photon is a soliton, and an electron is a toroid made from a photon's soliton, which is traveling along its own backbone. You see, the photon's own inwardly flowing ether holds its tail to its head. So if you have a string of magnets and you bring one around to the other, you'll notice that it sticks, and you can make, a big circle or a circle that goes around twice or 1 and 1.6 times. But in our case, it can only fit certain multiples of a circle. This, or half of that, going around twice or going around 3 times. So lambda, 2 lambda divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, and on. But usually there's just one. Like my mathematics show that every photon has only one stable state. But that doesn't preclude that multiple photons could join together and make stable states. So these are the building blocks of the universe. And when you apply this to yoga, you get a great, deep understanding of what really flowing energy is. And some people claim that prana and chi are different. One's at a much smaller size scale. It may be so, but when I talk about ether, I'm talking about the flow of the void or the space. That flow, that accelerating flow pattern that makes the turbulence that is the ether, I call that ether ether. And that ether gives us consciousness. And depending on where you draw your dotted line in 3D space and time, what region you're considering, you could have overlapping consciousnesses, or like my body seems like one consciousness, but when I get close to someone else and we come together, we sort of like one consciousness, because it becomes my etheric flux patterns overlaps with his, because you can't not overlap. They overlap because it's like 2 light bulbs. I mean, you can't, they don't have a dotted line around them. They emit outwards, and so they overlap, and one is going to light the other light bulb. And that's how humans are when they come together. Their etheric fields overlap, and so the ether going in there, who doesn't know who to go into. Who does this ether go into? That person or that person? So it sort of splits up. And so this is part of the interaction of those 2 people, is how that flow is affected. And empaths are sensitive to this, and they need to be alone for many, many hours a day, just to maintain health, because, I don't know, there's something with their flow pattern that if it can't be alone and it's with someone too long, it's like its own pattern doesn't work right. It's nothing against the other person. They could be God, but they sort of need, it's like they need this quiescent place in order to exist, because maybe their fields are weak, or maybe their skin is dry and they don't have a Faraday cage around them. Whatever the reason, empaths do need to have quiet time. And it's because of this etheric flux phenomenon. In my book on etheric flux, it's going to be having a subtitle something like An Heuristical Proposal on blah blah blah. Unification theory, I teach that a photon has average energy density peak that is a soliton, up, down, like that. And an electron has a more complex pattern which causes the electrons to travel, say for example, along a wire, in aligned like soldiers marching. Because these toroids have direction, and they have the twist, like as you're going around the toroid, you're twisting a certain direction. So they have these functions that make them only fit together a certain way because of the flows. Like if you put one that's flowing this way next to one that's flowing the opposite way, at the touching point, they'll repel, But if you turn it the other way, they're more stable. So whatever, electrons do repel each other, but the lowest energy of configuration is sort of like an ordered marching pattern, and that's how they travel. They travel on the wire like soldiers on the outskirts of the metallic lattice orbitals, on the outer lattices of the metallic orbitals. The metal molecule, the copper wire, that metal molecule has a lattice and a electronic orbital structure, and that outer structure is where the electrons move along. So they're sort of like going there like soldiers all marching together, and I call this entanglement. And I believe this type of entanglement is very similar, related, if not identical to the same entanglement that electrons feel when they're put in the physics experiments and they separate the two. They entangle them, then they separate them, and then they do something to one, and the other one is the opposite. So they say they're entangled. So I'm saying that the electrons that flow down a wire are also entangled. That's my hypothesis. Hope maybe someday somebody will have enough money to prove that. Yeah, so this ether flows through our bodies into us and makes patterns that are our mass. In other words, you aren't solid, you're light, literally light. So this ether, and being aware of the ether, and also aware that the ether flowing pattern is our consciousness, and that we aren't little billiard balls, but we're made out of flowing ether, and it never stops flowing and becomes a billiard ball. E equals mc squared. When that E, or that light wave, that light photon becomes mc squared, the mass times the speed of light squared, it may be that way on paper, some value for m, and that's how much it weighs when we hold it. But you're holding this massive thing, but it's still light. It's just light going in a circle. Like you can have a string of magnets over here, just loose, swing around. You can have those same magnets wrapped around in a little coil, and they seem really different, right? This one swings around, it has all this gyroscopic, things floating around, giving it torque and stuff. Whereas this is just a tiny little ball, so it has seems very different. But hey, they're still little magnets that are just going around in a little circle, so it's still moving ether. It's just, instead of moving like in a tornado that's real big comparatively, it's going in a little circle, a little twist, and that goes in a circle. So it's going in a tornado, which curves in on itself, and so it's going in a toroid. And so this twisting toroid is still flowing ether, flowing void, flowing zero-point field. It's never become solid. It's never become solid except in your personal eyeballs see it so small you can't imagine it being anything moving in there. It looks pretty still, so you assume it's solid, but it's not solid. It's light. That's what we need to think about when we think about our bodies. We're flowing light, flowing ether, and this is the language of the 21st century. And the first thing that novices will say is, oh, wait a minute, ether was proven not to exist. Space is a vacuum. That's like mid-20th century thinking, and really even pre-Einstein. But Einstein even said in his book, Relativity, a simple formula that anyone can understand, something like that, his book. He even said towards the end that there has to be an ether to transmit the force. And so, hello, he knows there's an ether. And we even call it, in science now, we call it the zero-point field. It's that energy level when everything is as quiescent as possible for us. That's the state of our universe, is that quiescence level. And they have a name for it. It's certainly not empty space. So, ooh, I didn't mean to get defensive. I love you. Thank you for listening, and peace.